I was standing naked in a freezing army tent when I heard voices outside. Then the door started to open, and I realized I was about to be exposed in the worst way imaginable. I don't talk about this day often, but it's one of those memories that sneaks up on me sometimes, especially when I smell something faintly burnt. It happened almost a decade ago, during my time in the Finnish Defense Forces, stationed around Kikala Airfield for a grueling 10-day stint of forest warfare training. Little did I know, this would become a chapter of my life I'd never quite shake. Let me set the scene. I wasn't exactly a model soldier. My role was essentially to be cannon fodder, a basic rifleman, though without any of the glory or fancy gear. I'd spent a good chunk of my service sick, lying in the infirmary, missing out on the joy of eating MREs and flopping around frozen forests like some kind of wounded fish. I wasn't upset about it, but for this particular exercise, I decided to tag along with the rest of the squad. Big mistake. My job was straightforward: keep fires going in the tents, serve food to the starving troops, and generally stay out of the way. But mostly, I sat around in the Vempa tent, a designated spot for the sick or injured who still had to show up but weren't much use to anyone. Unlike the well-hidden camouflage tents scattered in the forest, ours was smack in the middle of the training grounds, right next to the landing strip. It wasn't discreet, but who cared? I wasn't there to win medals, and that's where it happened. Boredom is a dangerous thing, especially for an 18-year-old with too much time on his hands. I don't know what possessed me, but at some point I thought, you know what would make me feel alive? Something risky. So I stripped down, completely, every stitch of clothing gone. Standing there in that drafty tent, I hunched over by the firebox, naked as the day I was born, and decided to, well, let's just say, I was determined to entertain myself. Now imagine the scene: the tent flap slightly ajar, letting in a stream of icy air, while I stood there like some kind of deranged golem, trying to summon enough enthusiasm to get the job done. It was a struggle. No visual aids, no privacy, just me, my thoughts, and a roaring fire. Things escalated quickly. I was so focused on finishing the mission that I didn't notice the voices outside until they were practically on top of me. My comrades had arrived for their meal break, tired and cold, calling out for me to serve the food. Panic set in, but I was too far gone. I couldn't stop now. I was too invested. So, there I was, speeding up like my life depended on it, trying to beat the clock as the men settled around the tent to eat. And then, success. Sort of. Let's just say it wasn't the cleanest operation. In my haste, I miscalculated. What should have been a controlled landing turned into a full-scale disaster. The worst of it? A sizable portion landed directly on the hot stove. The sound, tsh, was horrifying. But the smell? The smell was worse. It was like a blend of burning hair, sour milk, and sweaty boots, rising into the cold air like some unholy incense. I panicked, cleaned up as fast as I could, pulled on my clothes, and bolted out of the tent, pretending I'd been asleep and missed their calls. I served the food, sat down, and tried not to laugh like a madman as the guys started complaining about a god-awful smell in the tent. I played dumb, nodding along, while silently praying the fresh winter air would mask the carnage. Spoiler: it didn't. The smell lingered, haunting my tent mates for the rest of the exercise. I kept my head down, hoping no one would connect the dots. When we finally packed up and left, I breathed a sigh of relief, but deep down, I knew the truth. I would never live this down, not in my own mind anyway. Good times? Maybe. A cautionary tale? Definitely. Update 1. If you think the story ended when I packed up and left, think again. The universe wasn't about to let me walk away unscathed, and my tent mates weren't about to let that smell go without answers. The next day, back at the barracks, everyone was decompressing from the exercise. Spirits were high, except in my corner of the room, where my tent mates still looked like they'd been subjected to war crimes. "It's not normal, man," one of them muttered, sniffing his sleeping bag like a crime scene investigator. "What was that smell? It's burned into my nose." The guilt was crushing me, but I couldn't confess. I mumbled something vague about maybe the stove malfunctioning or the damp conditions messing with the fabric, and mercifully, they didn't push further. Not then, anyway. That night, I finally thought I'd escaped the worst of it. I climbed into my bunk, convinced the nightmare was behind me. But karma wasn't done with me. Because guess what I forgot? The sleeping bag. The same sleeping bag I'd accidentally marked during my moment of desperation. The smell hit me the second I crawled in. It was like the ghost of my shame had come back to haunt me, stronger than ever. I couldn't stay in there for more than a minute without gagging. I had to act fast. So, at 2 a.m., I snuck out of the barracks with my sleeping bag in tow, marching to the laundry area like I was disposing of evidence. I scrubbed that thing with more urgency than I'd ever put into any training exercise, praying it would come clean. Spoiler alert, it didn't. The next morning, the jokes started. Someone had left the laundry room door open, and the smell had wafted through the entire building. "What the hell died in there?" a guy from another unit asked during breakfast, wrinkling his nose. "Did someone try to roast a squirrel?" I laughed along nervously, shoving eggs into my mouth to avoid answering. My tent mates looked at me suspiciously, but didn't say anything. They probably thought I was just acting weird because of the smell. You'd think I'd learn to lay low, but no. A few days later, one of the sergeants called me out during an equipment check. "Mayleave, your sleeping bag smells like it's been dragged through hell and back. What happened?" I froze. This was it. My heart raced as I scrambled for an excuse. I think it got too close to the stove during the exercise," I stammered. "Maybe it caught some smoke." The sergeant raised an eyebrow but seemed to buy it. "Clean it properly or you're paying for a replacement," he snapped. Crisis averted. For now. But the universe wasn't done with me yet. The next time we went out for training, my tent mates started piecing things together. It was subtle at first. Comments about how the Vempa tent smelled weird, even before the stove incident. Then someone mentioned seeing the flap ajar when they came to eat, and how I'd seemed out of breath when I finally showed up with their food. "You were acting weird," one of them said casually as we set up our tents. "Like, really weird." "Yeah," another chimed in. "And you disappeared during lunch. What were you even doing in there?" I shrugged it off, muttering something about taking a nap, but the suspicion in their eyes was growing. And then, the kicker. One of them brought up the sound. "Now that I think about it," he said, narrowing his eyes, "there was this weird slapping noise coming from the tent right before you came out." My face burned hotter than the stove. I laughed it off, claiming it must have been the firewood cracking or some nonsense like that. But inside, I was panicking. They were getting too close to the truth. The real humiliation came a few weeks later, during a routine inspection of our gear. One of the higher-ups found something in my sleeping bag, a stain I'd apparently missed during my midnight cleaning spree. He called me out in front of everyone, holding it up like a piece of forensic evidence. "What the hell is this, Maylive?" I stammered something about spilled rations, but the damage was done. The other guys were howling with laughter, and my tent mates gave me looks that said they knew exactly what had happened, even if they couldn't prove it. From that day on, I was unofficially nicknamed Firestarter. I tried to play it off as a joke about my stove mishap, but deep down, I knew the truth. Every time someone called me that, I died a little inside. Looking back, I can't believe I thought I'd get away with it. The smell, the timing, the mysterious noises, it was like I'd left a trail of breadcrumbs straight to my shame. To this day, I can't smell burning wood without thinking about that tent, that stove, and the tss sound that will haunt me forever. Update 2. If you thought Firestarter was the end of it, you'd be wrong. Turns out, in the Finnish Defense Forces, nicknames have a way of spiraling completely out of control. What started as a few inside jokes among my tent mates quickly spread, and before I knew it, I wasn't just Firestarter. I was the Firestarter. Somehow this title turned me into a minor legend. It began with whispers. During drills, I'd hear snippets of conversations as I passed by. "That's him, right? The guy with the stove? No way, it can't be true. Who does that?" "Dude, I heard the tent smelled like burning shame for weeks." I tried to play dumb, but the more I denied it, the more people seemed convinced I was hiding something. One day, a guy I barely knew came up to me during lunch and asked, "So what really happened with the stove?" I froze. Nothing happened, it was just smoke damage. "Yeah, sure," he said, smirking. "That's not what I heard." At first, the rumors were relatively tame. People assumed I'd accidentally spilled rations on the stove or maybe burned my gear in a moment of incompetence. But then, someone added a new layer to the story. Apparently, I'd been caught naked in the tent when the incident happened. I don't know who started that part, but it spread like wildfire. Suddenly, I wasn't just the guy with the smelly sleeping bag. I was the guy who stripped down in the middle of training to have some kind of existential crisis by the fire. The details got more absurd with every retelling. By the end of the week, someone claimed I'd been performing some kind of bizarre ritual to summon forest spirits. Another version had me accidentally setting my pants on fire and using the tent flap to fan the flames. I didn't bother correcting them. After all, the truth was worse. Unfortunately, the legend didn't stay confined to the lower ranks. One day during morning assembly, one of the officers, who was known for having a wicked sense of humor, brought it up in front of everyone. "Before we begin," he said, barely suppressing a grin, "I'd like to remind you all about the importance of fire safety during training exercises. We wouldn't want anyone earning another nickname, would we?" The entire unit erupted in laughter. I wanted to sink into the ground and disappear, but I kept a straight face and stared straight ahead like a good soldier. Afterward, a few of the guys clapped me on the back, telling me I'd taken it like a champ. But inside, I was dying. Every time I thought the joke was over, someone found a way to resurrect it. By the time I finished my service, the nickname had stuck for good. It didn't matter that most of the people spreading the story didn't know the full or true version. All they cared about was that it was hilarious, and that it wasn't them. Even now, years later, I occasionally run into old comrades who greet me with a grin and a cheerful "Firestarter." Every time I smile and laugh along, but part of me is always wondering, do they know the real story? I guess I'll never know. All I can do is own it. After all, it's not every day you accidentally become a legend in your own right. Update 3. Time has passed, and while I've moved on from my military days, Firestarter has stayed with me in ways I never could have anticipated. It's like an old scar, faint but impossible to ignore. And as much as I wish I could say the story ended with my discharge, life had other plans. A few years after finishing my service, one of my old comrades reached out to organize a reunion. It sounded harmless enough, just a bunch of us getting together to reminisce over beer and bad decisions. But the second I walked into the bar, I knew I was doomed. "Firestarter!" someone bellowed the moment they saw me. The whole room turned to look, and then the laughter started. "Still lighting up tents, or have you moved on to barracks now?" one guy teased, clapping me on the back. I laughed it off, reminding myself it was all in good fun. But as the drinks flowed and the stories started flying, the legend of Firestarter got dragged out again, this time with me in the room to confirm or deny the details. "So," one of them said, grinning like a kid with a secret, "what really happened? We've heard the rumors, but come on, you owe us the truth." I hesitated, weighing my options. Part of me wanted to come clean, but another part, probably the smarter part, knew that admitting the truth would only fuel the fire, pun intended. In the end, I just shrugged and said, "Let's just say it was a long, cold night, and leave it at that." The room erupted in laughter, and I realized something. I didn't mind being the butt of the joke. At least it meant people still remembered me. Here's the thing about a nickname like Firestarter. It doesn't stay confined to one group of people. Over the years, the story has leaked into other parts of my life. Friends of friends hear about it. Co-workers catch wind of it. One time, during a company retreat, someone I'd just met casually dropped, "So, I hear you've got a thing for campfires," into the conversation. Even dating hasn't been safe. More than once, I've had to explain why a random buddy shouted "Firestarter" at me from across a crowded bar. Most people laugh it off, but let me tell you, trying to sound cool while downplaying a story about accidentally roasting your own shame is not easy. If there's one thing I've learned from all this, it's that you can't run from your past. No matter how embarrassing, ridiculous, or downright stupid it might be, it's always going to be a part of you. The best you can do is own it, and maybe try to laugh about it. Do I regret what happened in that tent? Honestly, sometimes I do, but other times I think about all the laughs it's brought, mine included, and I realize it's not so bad. After all, not everyone gets to be a legend, even if it's for something as absurd as accidentally creating a new smell category. This is the last you'll hear from me about Firestarter. It's been cathartic sharing the story, but I think it's time to let the past stay in the past, or at least try to. To everyone who's read this far, thanks for laughing along with me and maybe, just maybe, learning a little something about the dangers of boredom, bad decisions, and Finnish winter tents. Good times? You know what? Yeah, good times.